If the past few months have taught us anything, it's that Trump loves tariffs, hates trade deficits, and sees the former as the solution to the latter. Unfortunately for Trump, however, most economists agree that tariffs aren't a good way to fix a trade deficit, and Trump's lofty aspirations of reindustrializing America to create a self-sufficient manufacturing superpower looks somewhat far-fetched at the moment. Nonetheless, if Trump's tariffs don't have the desired effect, there is another way he could attack the trade deficit. Namely, by taxing capital flows into the US, or tariffing money. So in this video, we're going to take a look at this prospective plan to tariff money, whether it could actually happen, and whether it would actually work. Could you rank every single politician in the world? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, the World Leader Leaderboard. Find it on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favorite podcast app. So to understand why tariffing money could help ease America's trade deficit, you need to understand how trade deficits are financed. When a country runs a trade deficit, this just means that they import more than they export. Now, according to standard economic theory, trade deficits shouldn't last, and countries shouldn't run persistent trade deficits, because when you're importing more than you're exporting, this should make your currency weaker. That's because when you import, you essentially sell your currency to buy foreign currency, which you then use to buy foreign goods. Conversely, when you export, foreigners essentially buy your currency to then buy your stuff. So when you're running a trade deficit, i.e. importing more than you're exporting, this means that your currency is being sold more than it's being bought, which pushes down its value, meaning that you can't import as much stuff, and making your exports more competitive internationally. This process should continue until your trade account is balanced and your currency is stable. This all raises the question, how come the US has continued to run persistent trade surpluses for the past few decades? And, well, the answer is that money is constantly flowing into the US, which pushes up the value of the dollar and stops it from depreciating, as you would ordinarily expect it to do. These capital inflows are essentially used to fund or finance the trade deficit. So why is money constantly flowing into the US? Well, some of it is just because the US is just an attractive place for foreigners to invest and set up their businesses. But most of it is because foreign investors have long considered dollars and dollar-denominated assets like US treasuries to be safe assets, which they like to hold in reserves. Hence the US dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. One way of thinking about this is that the dollar and treasuries are sort of America's biggest export, but they aren't included when we calculate trade balance because they're not really goods or services in the usual sense, hence the massive trade deficit. Anyway, the point we're making is that the flip side to America's persistent trade deficit is its persistent capital surplus. In other words, the only reason that America can consistently afford to import more than it exports is because there's a constant stream of money flowing into the US. And this is why some unorthodox economists have suggested that if America wants to fix its trade deficit, it would be better off just reducing the amount of money flowing into the US, rather than trying to reduce the amount of goods and services it imports, which is what Trump is currently trying to do with his tariffs, by making imports more expensive. Now, this might sound a bit off-brand. After all, the US has spent most of the past few decades insisting that free capital flows are a good idea, and that everyone should let American companies into their domestic markets. But it's not an entirely new idea. Because back in 2019, towards the end of Trump's first term, Republican Senator Josh Hawley and Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin submitted a bill that called for a market access charge on foreign purchases of US stocks, bonds, and other assets. In other words, basically all money flowing into the US. Now, this bill didn't get much traction at the time, but in February, American Compass, a right-wing think tank closely associated with J.D. Vance, came out in support of the idea, calling for a 0.5% charge on all foreign purchases of US financial assets. A few days later, the White House then published an executive order titled the America First Investment Policy that pledged to review a 1984 treaty that, among other things, removed a prior 30% tax on capital inflows from China. So, does this mean that it could actually happen? Could Trump tariff capital inflows into the United States? Well, while it looks like something that senior figures in the administration might be open to, at the moment it looks like Trump is squarely focused on using bog-standard tariffs to address the trade deficit. Nonetheless, this doesn't mean that it won't happen in the medium term, especially if Trump's tariffs fail to fix the trade deficit, which is what most economists expect to happen. And, well, for what it's worth, we think that this might actually be a pretty good policy from Trump's perspective. We're not saying that we wholly endorse this policy, but if you want to close the trade deficit, and Trump does, this could both be an effective and politically easy way to do it. For starters, it wouldn't cause as much inflation as tariffs do, or cause as much disruption to supply chains, and thus American businesses. Secondly, it would raise at least as much revenue as Trump's tariffs, which is one of Trump's favorite talking points. It's hard to calculate how much revenue tariffs will actually raise, not least because Trump's tariff regime changes almost every day. But most estimates put it in the region of about $200 billion a year. A 0.5% market access fee, though, would probably raise at least as much as this, given that capital inflows into the United States amount to about $60 trillion a year. Thirdly, the levy could also be moved up or down depending on economic circumstances. If the deficit didn't fall, it could go up. Or if American companies suddenly needed more investment, it could go down. Fourth, it would put most of the strain on big American banks, who currently make a killing managing short-term capital flows and foreign money, rather than American households and manufacturers who suffer most from tariffs. And fifth, a one-off levy like the one proposed by Baldwin and Hawley would discourage short-term capital flows, but would have less of an impact on long-term investments. To give a concrete example, this would discourage foreign investors from betting speculatively on American stocks, but would have less of an impact on a company like TSMC that's planning to invest hundreds of billions of dollars over many years to build semiconductor factories in the US. Nonetheless, this policy would still represent a remarkable reversal of America's long-standing commitment to free trade, upset certain interest groups in Washington, and risk short-term turmoil in the markets. But if Trump's tariffs are already having these effects, a tariff on money might look like a tempting alternative. Regardless, in 2025, one thing is certain. We can expect the news cycle to continue being dominated by these same major figures. But who's the most influential? Well, in the most recent edition of our magazine, Too Long, we find out. That's because this 72-page issue runs down our official ranking of the world's most influential people, a vote that saw the TLDR team and more than 15,000 of you casting ballots. In the magazine, you'll learn the entire ranking, plus we've written articles about all of the top 25, discussing how they wield their influence and how they interact with and shape our world, including Modi's struggles in South India, how Elon took over, Giorgia Meloni's battles with the Italian judiciary, and Trump's monumental comeback story. Also, if you want to dive even deeper, the premium edition of the magazine also gets you access to bonus videos. That includes the team debating their rankings of the top 25, with it getting pretty heated at times.
We could potentially have a monumental jump on our hands.
Yeah.
Hands up for leapfrogging into sixth.
The most powerful European country, the second biggest economy, the nuclear power that is... The nuclear power!
Yeah.
We also recorded the team reacting to the audience's ranking, so you can find out what they really think about your votes. It's not just about the most influential people, though. Too Long also contains articles about the current state of the UK, the new right in Europe, and if peace can really hold in Gaza, along with a whole variety of other stories. Too Long truly is some of our very best journalism, with the audience consistently saying that previous issue vastly outstripped their expectations. So if you want a copy too, head over to toolong.news to pick one up. And if you never want to miss an issue, you can subscribe, which gets you a 20% discount on every issue as long as you stay a subscriber. Plus, just this week, if you use code INFLUENCE, you'll get an additional £3 off any subscription. Too Long helps to fund our journalism year-round and allows us to keep our YouTube videos free. So we really do appreciate your support.